The kid held it up by the blade like he was checking if a steak knife was sharp enough for dinner. "It's a knife," he said. "I mean, it's a nice knife, but it's a knife." Roy Pfeiffer stood on the other side of the counter in his canvas barn coat and his mesh-back cap from the feed store and watched a 27-year-old hold his father's hunting knife by the blade between his thumb and two fingers like it was something he pulled out of a kitchen drawer. "My father made that knife," Roy said. "Oh yeah? That's cool." The kid set it down on the glass counter. Blade first, no sheath, no cloth, just steel on glass. "Handmade knives are neat, but they're kind of a tough sell. People want brand names. Buck, Benchmade, maybe a K-bar. Custom stuff, unless it's got a name behind it, we can't really move it." He tilted his head. "I could do maybe $40. 45 with the sheath." $45. For a knife his father forged by hand in a shop behind the house in Boonville, Missouri, in 1952. For a knife that took 3 months to make. For the knife that his father used to dress every deer he killed for 40 years. And his father killed a lot of deer. For the knife that still had Roy's father's thumbprint pressed into the bolster because Emmett Pfeiffer had a habit of testing the metal before it cooled, and he'd pressed his thumb into the brass fitting while it was still warm and left a mark that 72 years of use hadn't worn away. $45. And the kid held it by the blade. Let me tell you about Roy Pfeiffer and his father's knife. Roy was born in 1947 in Boonville, Missouri, a small town on the Missouri River about halfway between Kansas City and St. Louis. Population then was maybe 7,000. Population now is about the same. It's the kind of town where the grain elevator is the tallest thing on the skyline, and the high school football game on Friday night is the social event of the week. Roy's father, Emmett Pfeiffer, was a blacksmith. Not a decorative blacksmith, not a hobbyist, not a guy who watched YouTube videos and bought an anvil. A real blacksmith. He'd learned from his father, who'd learned from his father, who'd come to Missouri from Württemberg, Germany, in 1871. 4 generations of Pfeiffers working steel. Emmett had a shop behind the house on Spring Street, a cinder block building with a coal forge, a 200-pound Peter Wright anvil that had been in the family since the 1890s, and a collection of hammers and tongs and files that Emmett could identify by feel in the dark. Emmett made everything: gate hinges, fireplace tools, horseshoes, hay hooks, log chains, wagon hardware for the Amish families in the county, and knives. The knives were what Emmett was known for. Not widely known. He never advertised, never sold through a catalog, never had a website because there was no such thing yet. He was known locally. In Cooper County and the counties around it, if you wanted a knife that would last longer than you did, you went to Emmett Pfeiffer's shop on Spring Street and you waited, because Emmett didn't rush. The knife Roy brought to the pawn shop was one Emmett made in 1952. Roy knew the year because Emmett scratched the date into the tang, the part of the blade that extends into the handle, the way he dated all his work. It was a drop-point hunting knife with a 5-inch blade forged from a piece of high-carbon steel that Emmett cut from an old leaf spring. Model A Ford, Roy believed, though Emmett never confirmed. The blade had been forge-welded, shaped, hardened, tempered, and hand-ground. The handle was a stack of leather washers, thin discs of saddle leather compressed and shaped on the tang, then sanded smooth and sealed with linseed oil. The bolster, the metal fitting between blade and handle, was brass, and in that brass was the thumbprint, Emmett's thumb pressed into warm metal, frozen there forever. The sheath was hand-stitched cowhide with a belt loop. Emmett made that too. The stitching was tight even, done with a saddle stitch and waxed thread. 72 years later, not a single stitch had come loose. That knife went everywhere with Emmett, not as a weapon, as a tool. He carried it on his belt every day the way Roy's generation carried a pocket knife. He dressed deer with it every November during hunting season. He used it to cut baling twine and whittle kindling and slice an apple at lunch. He sharpened it on a bench stone in the shop every Saturday, the same stone, the same motion, the same patience that went into making it. Roy grew up watching his father use that knife and sharpen that knife and carry that knife. He grew up in that shop too, sweating next to the forge, working the bellows, holding pieces with tongs while Emmett hammered. Roy wasn't a blacksmith himself. He didn't have the gift. He became a farmer. 240 acres of corn and soybeans outside Boonville, the same land his grandfather had farmed. But he understood steel the way farm kids understand steel. He knew the sound of good metal. He knew what a proper temper looked like. The straw yellow color that meant the blade would hold an edge without being brittle. He knew his father's work the way you know your father's handwriting. Emmett passed in 1994. Lung disease, 60 years of breathing coal smoke in a shop with no ventilation. He was 78. He died at home on Spring Street, in the bedroom above the shop, with the forge cold and the anvil silent and the knife on the nightstand. Roy took the knife home and put it in the top drawer of his gun cabinet, the drawer with the good stuff, the stuff that doesn't get used, the stuff that matters. Roy married Connie Holliday in 1973. She was a teller at the Farmers Bank on Main Street. He came in to deposit a grain check and she counted the money and smiled at him, and he said, "I'll bring another check tomorrow if you'll count it the same way." She laughed. They went to the Dairy Queen in Fayette for their first date. They were married 47 years. Connie passed in 2020, 69 years old, ovarian cancer. The diagnosis came in February. She was gone by September. She was the bookkeeper for the farm. She did the taxes, managed the crop insurance, kept the records. When she died, Roy discovered that he didn't know how any of it worked. He didn't know the login for the farm checking account. He didn't know when the property tax was due. He didn't know they owed $14,000 on a line of credit Connie had opened in 2017 to replace the well pump in the septic system. He didn't know because Connie handled it and he'd never asked. And here's the thing that every widow and widower in the audience already knows. It's not the grief that gets you, the grief you expect. It's the paperwork. It's the passwords. It's the auto pay that stops when you cancel the credit card and suddenly the electric company wants $340 in back payments because Connie had it set up on a card that died when she did. It's sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a pile of envelopes and a calculator and realizing that the person who understood all of this is gone and didn't leave a manual because she thought she'd be here to explain it. That's something a lot of men Roy's age would understand, not because they didn't care about the money, but because the division of labor in a 47-year marriage is absolute and you don't question what works until what works stops working. Now Roy was 78 and the farm was getting away from him. Not the land. The land was fine. Danny Huber was farming it better than Roy could at this point. It was the house. The farmhouse was built in 1941 by Roy's grandfather, and it looked like a house built in 1941 that had been maintained by 3 generations of men who knew how to fix things, but not how to update them. The wiring was original in the back bedrooms. The plumbing made sounds at night that Connie used to say were ghosts, and Roy used to say were pipes, and they were both probably right. The kitchen floor had a soft spot near the sink that Roy covered with a piece of plywood and a rug. The porch was listing to the east. Everything worked. Nothing worked well. Roy's daily routine was the routine of a man living alone on a farm. Up at 5:30, because that's when he'd always gotten up and the body doesn't forget. Coffee, Folgers, black, the same brand Connie bought for 47 years, and he wasn't going to switch now. Check the weather on the TV, drive the fence line if the truck was cooperating, feed the 2 barn cats that had survived from a litter of 6. Eat lunch, usually a bologna sandwich or a can of Hormel chili. Watch the news at noon, nap in the recliner, drive to town if he needed something. Supper at 5, frozen dinners mostly, Hungry Man or Banquet, the ones that come in the black plastic trays. Connie would have been horrified. TV until 9. Bed. That was the day. Every day. Pill organizer to pill organizer, frozen dinner to frozen dinner. He'd leased the cropland to a neighbor, Danny Huber, who farmed 1,200 acres and was happy to add Roy's 240 to the rotation. The lease brought in $38,000 a year. Decent money, but after property tax, the line of credit payment, insurance, and the cost of maintaining a farmhouse built in 1941, there wasn't as much left as you'd think. Roy's Social Security was $1,620 a month. After everything, he had about $80 left over. The truck, a 2005 Chevy Silverado with 211,000 miles, needed a clutch. The estimate from the shop in Boonville was $1,800. Without the truck, Roy couldn't check the fences, couldn't get to town, couldn't haul anything. He was a farmer without a truck, which is like being a fisherman without a boat. His son, Emmett Jr., named after his grandfather, was a welder in Springfield. Good job, union benefits, but he had a mortgage and a kid in travel soccer and a wife who'd just gone back to school for nursing. Roy's daughter, Nancy, was in Columbia, working as a legal secretary. She called every week. She worried. Roy told her he was fine. He wasn't fine, but that's what you say. Roy didn't call either of them. He thought about what he could sell. The farm equipment was leased. The cattle were sold off in 2018. The house was full of furniture that wasn't worth the gas to haul it to a shop. The only thing Roy owned that someone might pay real money for was the knife. He didn't want to sell it. That knife was his father's hand. The thumbprint in the bolster was literally his father's hand, pressed into brass in 1952 and still there. Every ridge, every whorl, as clear as the day Emmett touched it. Selling the knife was like selling the last handshake. But the clutch needed replacing, and the truck wasn't optional. A farmer without a truck is a man sitting in a house watching his fences fall down. Roy drove the Silverado to town every Tuesday for groceries, to the co-op for feed, to the VFW hall for the Wednesday night fish fry, where he sat with the same 4 men he'd sat with for 20 years, and they talked about weather and cattle prices and whose hip was worse. Without the truck, he'd lose all of that. And at 78, alone on 240 acres, losing all of that was the same as losing everything. Roy wrapped the knife in the sheath, put it in the inside pocket of his barn coat, and drove the Silverado, grinding into third, slipping out of second, to Riverfront Pawn on Main Street in Boonville. The kid behind the counter was named Austin Briggs, 27, clean-cut, store polo shirt in dark green with the shop logo, khaki pants, a lanyard with a name tag that said Austin. He was polite enough, said yes sir and no sir the way Missouri kids are taught. But he was 27, and to a 27-year-old in a pawn shop, a handmade knife without a brand name on the blade was a handmade knife without a brand name on the blade, $45. Roy looked at the knife on the counter, the brass bolster, the leather handle darkened with 72 years of hand oil. The blade, still sharp, Roy kept it sharp the way Emmett kept it sharp, same stone, same motion, $45. He started to pick it up. Nobody in that shop knew what Roy was holding. Subscribe to Hidden Worth. You don't want to miss this. The front door opened. A man walked in, late 50s, barrel-chested, buzz-cut going gray, a Carhartt vest over a flannel shirt, jeans, Red Wing boots. He carried a canvas tote bag and a coffee from Casey's. His name was Dale Kessler. He was a Master Bladesmith, a member of the American Bladesmith Society, one of only around 120 living master smiths in the world. He was also a knife appraiser and historian who worked with auction houses, museums, and private collectors specializing in American handmade knives. The owner of Riverfront Pawn, a woman named Sheila, had Dale come in whenever a knife came through that looked like it might be more than a hardware store blade. Sheila had texted Dale a photo when Roy first set the knife on the counter. Dale was at Casey's getting gas. He drove straight over. Dale set his coffee down. He looked at the knife on the counter. He didn't touch it. He stood about 2 feet away and studied it. The blade profile, the handle construction, the bolster, the overall proportions. "May I?" he asked Roy. Roy nodded. Dale picked up the knife by the handle, never the blade. He held it in his right hand, testing the weight and balance. He turned it blade up and looked at the grind, the angle of the bevel, the evenness of the edge. He held it up to the light and looked down the spine for straightness. He turned it over and examined the bolster. And stopped. He saw the thumbprint. He rubbed his own thumb across it gently. He looked at it through a small loop he took from his vest pocket. He set the knife down on a soft cloth he'd laid on the counter. He carried his own cloth, the way all serious knife people do. "Who made this?" he asked. Not casually, carefully. "My father," Roy said. "Emmett Pfeiffer. He was a blacksmith here in Boonville, had a shop on Spring Street." Dale looked at Roy for a long moment. Then he looked back at the knife. "Emmett Pfeiffer," he said. "Your father was Emmett Pfeiffer. You know his work?" "Sir." Dale set the knife down and looked at Roy. "I need you to understand something. I've been making knives for 34 years. I have my Master Smith rating. I've appraised over 1,000 blades, and I have a photograph of one of your father's knives pinned above my forge. I look at it every day I work. Your father's forge technique. His ability to read the color of the steel, to know by the shade of orange exactly when the metal was ready to move. That's something you can't teach. You either see it or you don't. Emmett saw it. Everyone in the American Bladesmith Society knows Emmett Pfeiffer's work. Your father is considered one of the most significant American bladesmiths of the 20th century. He never joined the ABS. It didn't exist until 1976. But his techniques, his forging methods, his heat treatment processes, they're studied. I have photographs of 3 of his knives in my reference library. The ABS archives have documentation of his forge welding technique. His knives are in the collections of at least 4 major knife collectors in the United States. Austin's polo shirt seemed to shrink on him. Dale picked up the knife again. He examined the blade near the ricasso, the flat section between the blade and the handle. This is leaf spring steel, likely 5160 or similar. The forge work is exceptional. You can see the grain structure where the blade meets the bolster. No inclusions, no cold shuts, no delamination. The grind is hand done. You can see the slight asymmetry that distinguishes hand grinding from machine work. This is the mark of a man who ground by eye and got it right. He pointed to the handle. Stacked leather washer handle. Traditional. But look at the compression. Every washer is uniform. The sanding is flawless. The linseed oil seal has darkened with age and hand use, which gives it this beautiful patina. He held it to his nose. You can still smell the leather in the oil. He turned to the bolster. And this thumbprint in the brass. I've read about this. Emmett Pfeiffer was known for pressing his thumb into the bolster while the brass was still warm. It was his signature. Every knife he made has this mark. It's the equivalent of a painter signing a canvas. He set the knife on the cloth. "Mr. Pfeiffer, this knife, handmade by Emmett Pfeiffer, dated 1952, with original sheath, original handle, the maker's thumbprint signature in the bolster, and direct family provenance from the maker's own son, at a specialized knife auction or through a collector network. You would be looking at $45,000 to $65,000. He paused. $56,000 is a reasonable midpoint. $56,000. The shop went quiet. Austin stood behind the counter with his mouth open. $45. He'd offered $45. He'd held the blade between his fingers like a butter knife. He'd set it down on glass. He'd said, "It's a nice knife, but it's a knife," about a piece made by one of the most respected American bladesmiths of the 20th century, carrying the maker's literal fingerprint in the brass. Roy didn't move. He was looking at the thumbprint, his father's thumb. He'd touched that thumbprint 10,000 times, held the knife and rubbed his own thumb over his father's mark and felt the ridges and thought about the shop on Spring Street and the coal forge and the sound of Emmett's hammer on the anvil, steady as a heartbeat, ringing across the yard on summer evenings while Roy did chores and Connie called them in for supper. $56,000, Roy said, like he was reading a number off a grain receipt and couldn't believe the price of corn. "I'd recommend heritage auctions or a direct consignment through the ABS collector network," Dale said. "There are knife collectors who have been looking for documented Pfeiffer pieces for years. This knife, with the provenance, the thumbprint, and the condition, it won't last long on the market." He handed Roy his card. Austin opened his mouth. "Sir, I didn't know your dad was... If you want, I could call Sheila and..." Roy looked at him. Not angry. Roy didn't get angry much. Farmers don't, because it doesn't help. He just looked at Austin with the same patience he'd use on a calf that got through a fence. A problem that'll sort itself out if you give it a minute. Son, Roy said, there's a thumbprint in that brass. My father's actual thumb. And you picked it up by the blade. Austin looked at the floor. Roy picked up the knife by the handle, the way you pick up a knife, the way Emmett picked it up, the way every man who knows anything about knives picks one up. He slid it into the sheath. He put it back in his coat pocket. He nodded to Dale. He walked out into the Missouri afternoon. Let me tell you what happened. Roy called Dale that evening. Dale drove out to the farm the following Saturday and spent 3 hours in Roy's living room documenting the knife, photographing the blade, the handle, the bolster, the thumbprint, the tang date. Roy took him out to the shop on Spring Street. It was still standing, the anvil still there, the forge cold for 30 years. Dale photographed the shop, the anvil, the tools. He called it a time capsule. Roy also found something in the shop he'd forgotten about, a ledger book, Emmett's order book from 1948 to 1987. Every knife he ever made, logged by hand. Customer name, knife type, blade length, steel type, handle material, date completed, price charged. The 1952 knife was on page 14. Hunting knife, drop point, 5-inch blade, leaf spring, leather stack handle, brass bolster, personal use. Price, none. Emmett made it for himself. Dale consigned the knife through the ABS collector network. Word spread fast. Within 2 weeks, 3 serious collectors had expressed interest. The knife was offered at a private sale rather than auction. Dale said the right buyer would pay more privately than at auction because collectors of American blade work are a small, passionate community and they don't like bidding against each other in public. The knife sold for $58,400 to a collector in Montana who owned the largest private collection of American handmade knives in the country. The collector requested the ledger book as well. Roy sold it separately for $4,200. The collector planned to display both the knife and the ledger in a dedicated Pfeiffer exhibit in his private gallery. After Dale's commission, Roy received just over $51,000. He got the clutch fixed, $1,800. He paid off the line of credit, $14,000. He had the farmhouse roof patched and the porch rebuilt, $3,800. He put $20,000 in savings. He sent Emmett Jr. $5,000 for the kids' soccer and told him it was from Grandpa Emmett. He sent Nancy $3,000 and told her to stop worrying. The Peter Wright anvil is still in the shop on Spring Street. Roy won't sell it. The forge is cold and the hammers hang on their pegs and the tongs are in a barrel by the door. Roy goes out there sometimes on Saturday mornings and stands in the shop and listens. There's nothing to hear. The forge is cold. The anvil is silent. But Roy listens anyway, the way you listen for a sound you remember from childhood, not because you expect to hear it, but because the listening itself is the point. Emmett Pfeiffer made knives for 39 years. He charged $15 for a hunting knife in 1952. He charged $45 for one in 1987. He never charged more than $60 for anything he made. He never knew his work was studied. He never knew collectors would pay $56,000 for a knife he made for himself in a cinder block shop behind his house. He just made knives, good ones. And he pressed his thumb into the brass because that's how you sign something when you're a blacksmith. Not with a pen, with your hand. A kid in a pawn shop picked it up by the blade and said $45. He didn't know. They never do. If this story reminded you that worth isn't always obvious, subscribe to Hidden Worth. We have more stories like this one, and every single one of them will surprise you. Because some things have hidden worth.